There are different ways of um, describing um, the human experience, and at different phases of the spiritual journey, different descriptions will seem more appropriate, because the shifts, the changes, the way we are seeing life at different phases are emphasizing different aspects of the human experience, and therefore some descriptions will seem more appropriate, more accurate at certain times when our experience of life, when the experience of life is arising, being seen and felt a particular way. And often what is described in this teaching, because it's keeping it very practical and approaching the topic from the bottom up, which really means starting at the daily living, the practical, the duality level, and moving from the duality level to the non-dual view. And some teachings do it the other way. They come from the top down, where they will talk about what you are as essence, and not refer to the body and form, not refer to circumstance and all of the concepts that apply to daily living. So there are these two different approaches, and whichever approach is taken, eventually the two ends of that spectrum, the daily living and the more esoteric sides of life and the human being, need to be integrated, so we come to know essentially the whole, which includes the both sides, the form, causal, time and space, and the deeper dimension, you could say, that is outside of time and space, outside form. And they're not mutually exclusive, but they coexist, and they can be felt simultaneously. They can become part of the whole. So whichever way the teaching is presented, eventually there has to be an integration of both the transcendent and the descendant. And so in this teaching, we really do talk about being the human being, living in life, doing exactly what you need to do given the circumstance in each moment. And I guess the descriptions are that liberation, freedom, is essentially about being very ordinary, being a human being, knowing yourself as a human being, and continuing to function in life, going to work, looking after your family, being with friends, spending time alone, whatever the circumstance may be, however life moves you, but finding yourself at peace, finding yourself free of an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other. And that's a very radical change in our makeup, because it's evident that the way life has been created, whether you want to look at that as the life experience in the moment, a sort of a spontaneous creation with all of the different components, or whether you want to look at it as an evolution, the way life has been created is to include an uncomfortableness as part of our sense of being in life, an uncomfortableness with who we are. And that uncomfortableness is based on what's happened in the past and a holding on to that. It's based on a looking into the future and feeling very fragile and dependent on what happens in the future. And it's based on looking at what's happening in the present moment and feeling challenged and unsatisfied, complaining about how things are. And so that's essentially the way the human has been designed to function as a standard, as a general default, to function throughout the day, looking at the past, looking into the future, and complaining and resisting the present moment. And a lot of that is not sort of an activity that we have to look at our to-do list and check it off the to-do list and do it actively. It's a ingrained, unconscious way of being in life. So we just find ourselves feeling that way. Feeling, generally speaking, we can say unsatisfied and uncomfortable with life. And that uncomfortableness can range from a mild uncomfortableness that has been normalized, essentially, where someone might not even know, or might not even feel that they are uncomfortable, and it only becomes evident when levels of comfortableness set in, and then it becomes evident, wow, I really was uncomfortable but didn't realize it. And for other people, the intensity of the uncomfortableness is pronounced, and so they know they're not comfortable. And then obviously we have the in-between where you are uncomfortable, and then there are periods of peak uncomfortableness that happen. And in practical terms, that uncomfortableness comes in the form of, as I said, looking back at the past, the future, and the present, and those mental attachments to the past, present, and future arise in the form of guilt, blame, and pride, which are all attitudes to our actions, the good ones, or the actions that lead to good, positive outcomes, pleasurable outcomes, and the actions that lead to painful, negative, unpleasant outcomes. So an attitude towards the outcomes that are positive and negative that happen through us, and the attitude towards the mainly negative things, but sometimes the positive things where we're comparing ourselves to other people. So that's the guilt and pride is in relation to the actions happening through me, and blame and hatred when looking at the actions that have happened to the other. So that's one half of the human uncomfortableness, feeling of guilt, which can, in its most intense form, be a deep sense of shame and unworthiness and not feeling good enough. It can be a milder form of embarrassment, or just feeling like you didn't really perform very well as a friend or as a child or as a parent. Or as a employee, without it becoming a very deeply ingrained sense of shame. So a milder form of guilt, which essentially is a milder form of shame. The resentment and blame, or blame towards the other, which is different forms of hatred. There can be strong, intense hatred. There can be just irritation with someone and general dislike. You can have jealousy. So all sorts of different forms of blame, judgment towards the other for being a certain way is a form of blame. There's the pride for one's own actions, and actions that deliver a positive outcome, and we say, look what I've achieved. And that pride is really an uncomfortableness, because it isn't recognizing our connection to source. It isn't recognizing that life is living us. It isn't recognizing that our true nature is not the doer, but rather that which is aware of life, and that essence that is aware of life has a very restful, harmonious existence with life. And the pride that sees itself as the doer is the same attitude that feels inadequate, and the same attitude that is always judging the other. And so the shame and the judgment tend to be more intense forms of not knowing oneself, intense forms of this attitude of doership, which is not what we are. We are not the doer. And the pride also has that flavor in it. It just may be less bitter until it gets felt relative to the absence of it. And then it becomes very clear that this sense of superiority is not superiority and arrogance, and claiming ownership is not at all a healthy sense of self. And then there is the attachment to outcome, which is also underlying the guilt and blame and pride, because the belief in personal doership and attributing doership to the other and oneself is really doership in relation to an outcome. And so there is this attachment to outcomes, so being proud about the outcome that we're attached to, and feeling shameful about an outcome that inevitably we're attached to, because if we weren't attached to that outcome, we'd let it go. And then there is a more specific attachment to outcome, a more direct attachment to outcome, where the blame, shame, and pride are not present. And that is when worry and anxiety arise, where we're just concerned about how the future will turn out without blaming anyone, but just concerned about outcomes, convinced that something is going to go wrong. In the terms of in the form of anxiety, often we think something has gone wrong and I just haven't found out about it yet. And expectation can be a milder form of suffering until once again we get to feel its absence. Expectation could be hoping for something positive, regurgitating, imagining how things are going to turn out. And that imagination is different to the anxiety. It's an imagination of how great it's going to be when life turns out a particular way. So once I get a better job, or when I finish university, or once I've moved to a new country, or once the lockdown is finished, and we're imagining how things will be with the sense that, that's when everything will be okay. And that expectation is very different to putting in place a functional plan, where you have an idea of something you would like, and it doesn't exist now, and you have a plan as to how it might exist in a week's time or 2 weeks' time. And so if you think about the various options and you say, okay, that's the trajectory I'm going to take with the aim and hope that this is the outcome, that planning is functional thinking. If we then are regurgitating the imagination over and over and over to the point where it's not delivering a plan that wasn't already in place, to the extent where it's not delivering functional understanding of what we need to do next and why we need to do it, and whether it's achievable given the resources that we have, etc. If it's just repeating over and over what we're going to do when we get there and how great it's going to be, then it's turned into an expectation. And that thinking really keeps us disconnected from resting in our own being in the present moment. And that's expectation. And then when the future becomes the present and it isn't delivered, then, or in fact, maybe the opposite is delivered. So you go to the airport and you find that you've missed your plane. You got there at 6 p.m. when in fact the flight was 6 a.m. And the feeling that can come in is beyond the pain. So it makes sense that if you realize that this has happened, there's going to be a biological reaction of momentary disappointment. And then once that reaction is over, there can be a sense of, well, that's life. This is destiny unfolding. It's not great as far as my preferences go. It's cost me money. It means I won't get to go where I was going on time or at all. But there can be an attitudinal adjustment to that within a very short period of time. So as soon as the biological response to the situation, which is showing the disappointment, the biological disappointment, and before it turns into horizontal uncomfortableness with oneself, but why did this happen? Who's to blame? What it means about your life. Before it turns into all of that, it can get cut off. And then there's just the biological reaction because of the circumstance as it's turned out. And then peace, because it's understood. However, if the attachment to that is there, then the biological pain is going to turn into horizontal suffering, where there is going to be a sense of uncomfortableness with oneself and an uncomfortableness with how life has turned out. And that can go on for days, weeks, months, years, a whole lifetime sometimes, depending on what it is that has turned out not in line with our expectations. So attachment to outcome is this feeling when a circumstance hasn't worked out. And obviously it's very linked in with guilt and blame. So we might be attached to the outcome, feeling it's terrible, and blaming ourselves for having got it all wrong. So that's more or less a description of the suffering, and the end of the process, or the happiness that is available for the human being, is said to be very simple peace of mind in daily living, which means you still find yourself in daily living, but the suffering in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation doesn't accompany the momentary experience, meaning your time during the day. There's the pleasure and pain of circumstance, but now you find yourself at peace. You find yourself connected to your essence that you know is unaffected and will remain regardless of how the circumstance turns out. And from that place, the human being feels much more in flow with life, much more lived by life. Decisions can be made with much more ease. That just tends to happen because it's understood that life needs decisions to happen, to unfold. It's understood that if a decision is made and it isn't the decision that leads to the optimal outcome, then that outcome is just pleasure or pain, and it was destined for that to... So the importance of decisions is understood on a circumstantial level. However, the lack of control over the outcomes is also understood. And so there's less of the psychological me involved in the decision-making process. And so decisions tend to happen more organically. Now, to get to that point where the movement, the psychological movement, the movement of the thinking mind, as opposed to the working mind, which is the functional thinking that is needed in order to engage in circumstance. So if we think that freedom or liberation is the end of thinking, we've possibly thrown the baby out with the bathwater, because if we prayed to God to please stop my thinking, take away my intellect, we would be very, we wouldn't even be disappointed if God obliged, because we wouldn't have the intellect to be able to process anything. So the point is that we need an intellect in order to be able to function as a human being on a functional and practical level. So if we think that it's about the end of thinking, we have probably got an expectation that is not the reality. But it is about the end of the thinking mind. The thinking mind refers to our attitude to circumstance, the guilt, the blame, the pride, the worry, and the expectation. And all of that is this extra load of uncomfortableness on top of the functional thinking of how to get things done in the present. So in order for that to change, sometimes it's important to put forward concepts that don't talk about the human being, don't talk about you as if you are a person. And the reason being is that we know ourselves as a person, and we know life as it relates to the person with the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership and attachment to outcomes. And so that essentially is a narrative that arises, and so that is the unhappiness, is the way we found ourselves, is to know ourselves as a person with this belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome, and therefore our commentary, our judgment, our assessment of what's happening is always relative to this sense of who I am. And so one of the ways of starving that habit is to essentially undermine the belief that you are a person. Because for as long as the belief you are a person is there, then the thinking that is associated with the type of person you know yourself as, the type of the identity, the psychological identity that has been put in place, will continue to function. And so describing the non-doership and the non-attachment part of the person and saying, oh, that's the piece of the person that causes all the suffering, and the rest of the person continues and needs to be there. And that's how I would say that's what actually happens, is the whole person doesn't dissolve. There is a person. And at the end of the process, we'll find, oh, I'm still a person, and yet I'm a person that now gets to find oneself in life, find the reaction and the interaction with life to be practical, biological, but without that additional functioning that we used to call, or can still call, the thinking mind, which is the psychological attitude to life, that is the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. So without that, so that's what I would say would actually happens. However, I did say earlier on that at various stages it may be appropriate to describe things differently. The human being has an aspect to themselves that's covered up. It gets covered up by this false idea of who we are. And the false idea of who we are has been put in place because of how our experience of life keeps showing up. And we don't create the experience. It is what we wake up to, the experience of life. It is how we feel ourselves when we're interacting with others. And those feelings arise so automatically, we might think that, oh, I created that, I shouldn't feel that way. But actually the feeling arises and then it's registered, then it's felt. So the pattern arises, and then the pattern, whatever it is registered by awareness. And so that's not our creation. It's not our doing. Because it keeps popping up so consistently, we tend to form a belief, not consciously again, but the system. The system is a learning system. It does so many things on its own without us realizing. So if you drive a car for an hour, in the first hour of driving a car, you will get used to it. If you do anything that you haven't done before, after an hour of doing it, you'll find that automatically the body picks up. And if you're playing a computer game, let's say, you haven't played a computer game before, and you think, how do you control these cars and stuff? It's so awkward. And then after an hour, your fingers are just controlling the car so much better, and it's sort of like autopilot. And the body has learnt that through experience. It's not that there is this me that has taught the body how to how to function, but rather the body just does it, and the feedback loop of experience molds the way it functions. And so the experience that we have in each moment of life tends to put in place an idea of how life is. And that idea of how life is has essentially given us the idea that we are largely a physical being. Because that's the experience. If you bump into a wall, it hurts. And so very quickly, based on your experience, you get an idea of what your boundaries as the physical boundaries are. And you don't have to bump into a wall. You're just picking up a cup, and just even feeling the wind on your face tends to create a feedback in the experience of what I am physically. And so that becomes our idea of who we are based on how the experience is presenting. And that idea of who we are ignores, overlooks, doesn't appreciate an aspect of the human being that is very much part of the human being. So essentially, we know half of ourselves. We know the physical half of ourselves. We also know the emotional and the psychological part of ourselves. So we're familiar with the fact that we feel psychological, uncomfortableness, and we have emotions. So we also have this idea about ourselves being physical and emotional, psychological. What we don't have an appreciation of is the formless consciousness that is at our core, is what we could call the core of the human being, the electricity of the human being, the presence of the human being. So, one thing that we are all the time, but we don't realize it, is aware and present, which means there is this sense I am, but it's this sense I am and this awareness is lost, in a sense, it's not lost. It's very much here. It's just not appreciated. If someone could flicker that sense of presence on and off very quickly, we'd suddenly realize what this presence, this I am, is, and we'll realize, it's always been the sort of light functioning through the human being. And because it's so lacking in characteristics, unlike emotion, excitement, sadness, flatness, and the same with the psychological arisings like blame and shame and pride and anxiety. All of those have very intense characteristics of form. So even emotion, hopefully you understand when I'm using the word form, not necessarily meaning solid form, but you can almost, you can feel them. So they have a form that can be registered. The sense of existence and the awareness are much more subtle. And so they go unnoticed, unappreciated. And so the human being that doesn't know that aspect of themselves, and I like referring to it as the quantum aspect of the human being, the deep, the formless, the timeless, the ever-present. So it's got very different qualities to it than the part of the human being that engages in circumstance. And yet it's not separate from that part that engages in circumstance. So it's the human being is made up of the mechanical and the quantum, and they are two aspects of the whole. And so when we are unfamiliar with that quantum part of ourself, life becomes very much about somewhere to go. It's about an objective and achieving an objective. So very much about the destination. It's very much the human becomes a movement from here to there, and it's a movement outwards. And so life then becomes a framework of how to get things. That becomes the way that we relate to and we feel life. It's about getting somewhere and getting something in order to meet our purpose or our objective. We assume that that's what it's all about. So it's great to hear, life is not at all what we imagine it to be. Not at all what we feel it to be. Because we're feeling it from with only an appreciation of, let's say, half of what the human being is. An appreciation of it from the point of view of knowing ourselves as a physical entity only, physical and emotional, with a psychological me running the show. So the psychological me is the part that says, okay, so given this is who I am and this is what's important, and to get to be complete, I need to go out and achieve certain things and make life look a certain way. Then with that psychological me, the movement of life, the sense of life is in a very specific direction. And so it's great to hear that life is not at all what we experience it as. Why do I say that? And because we do need to start looking at life with a sense of awe. Like, what is it? Like, if it's not what I know life as, it's much more mystical, is one way of saying. Much more mystical than we generally know life as, because we don't know life including the quantum aspect. Not only the quantum aspect of the human being, but if we come to know the quantum aspect of the human being, we know the quantum aspect of life. And we know the quantum aspect of life and the quantum aspect of the human being as not being two. And so essentially we know the physical, the mechanical aspects of life. And so when that's the case, life is something very specific. It's very three-dimensional. I was going to say it's very two-dimensional, but we can't really say that in this example. It's just very three-dimensional. And life is so much more than that. Isn't it strange that usually as a figure of speech, if we want to say we don't get something, we say it appears very two-dimensional. And when we really see it, it's like three-dimensional. And in this case, the example just I have to say, I can't say life is very two-dimensional. Life actually is, on the mechanical level, very three-dimensional. But three-dimensional is missing so much. It's missing the appreciation of the quantum side of life, where the dimensions, the dimensionality of life, the time aspect and the space aspect collapse in a way. Life is perceived at no distance. Life is apperceived. Life is apperceived where time and space morph into the present. And so life can be appreciated as something far more mystical than we knew it as. That is the doorway, or what I'm describing as presence. The being in the moment is, we've all heard being in the moment. Like, what does it really mean? The way I'm describing it here is that we need to come in contact with an aspect of the human being that is the core of the human being that everyone has, that has been overlooked. And so to wonder what being in the moment is, to try to be in the moment when we're not actually being pointed into connection with this deeper aspect of the human being, is going to lead to frustration. Because the doorway to presence is to connect to this part of ourself that has been covered up. Part of ourself that we haven't been moving towards because we've been moving towards a destination, towards outcomes. And so, if I've been out working in the garden, chopping wood or moving things, there can be an intensity, and so I could work for half an hour being quite physical and maybe get a good result, maybe find that something broke, and I've been working for half an hour trying to fix something that I didn't even expect was going to break and need fixing. And so after half an hour, I haven't even started getting anywhere in terms of the job I hoped to do. And there can be a moment where there's just a stopping. And it's not about what was being done. It's about remembering, and here we are. This is life. Doing this work, and it doesn't mean that that was forgotten. It just means that there is the capacity to So that doesn't mean that while I was doing the task, being physical, let's say, that there was suffering. It just means there was involvement in the task at hand, and so quite possibly no suffering in that. And then there's just this stopping and going, life is about just here. So the task then is put on hold, just for a bit, because it's about appreciating the fact that we're alive. But it's not an appreciation with a thought that happens where we say, oh, I should appreciate that I'm alive. There is, with this connection to this deeper part of ourself, knowing that really that was just about how life, the content of life. And when we stop, we're not really stopping. It's just that that content is being replaced by watching the trees or the cars or the other person, but without needing to go anywhere. Just an appreciation of the presence functioning through us. And how life, the experience of life, is completely dependent on this presence. And that doesn't mean at all that we are going to spend the whole day just aware of presence and the trees and the people, because the job of stacking the wood or fixing the car still needs to happen from a practical point of view, and so we'll get back to it. Maybe look around for 30 seconds, catch our breath, sit down because the body is tired, feel connected, marvel at what is this, what is life, this appearance in consciousness. The body is appearing in consciousness, is registered by the consciousness, the awareness, the sense of existence that supports all of the experience of life. That not a leaf can exist as part of the experience if it isn't supported by the awareness. If it isn't powered, you can say, lit up by the awareness. So nothing in our daily life experience is outside of the awareness. It's all dependent on the light of awareness that is functioning through us, illuminating the experience. And so that's where we can come to know life as an arising, an appearance, an experience in consciousness, made of consciousness, witnessed by consciousness. And what we find is in that appearance, in that experience arising in consciousness, made of consciousness, witnessed by consciousness, there is also the physical aspect of the human being functioning. And so it's not one or the other. It's not, well, what am I? Am I the human being inside life? Or am I the awareness in which life arises? And it's both. You're both. And not only are you both, but those are two aspects of the human being. There is the aspect of the human being that is prior to the experience of the human being. And there is the aspect of the human being that is the experience. And both are the human being. Both are aspects of the human being. So you can shift, if you want, to being the awareness in which everything arises. You can shift to being the body inside a world. Or you can find your experience as a hybrid of the two. And it can be a moving feast. You can have one week where you know yourself primarily as the body. Another week where you know yourself as formless awareness in which everything arises. And another week where you are knowing yourself as a hybrid, as both the body and formless awareness. And it can be 1 hour and 1 hour and 1 hour, or 10 seconds. And it can also all be all of that simultaneously. And that is an opening up of the experience of life, where life is so much more than we knew it as. So why would I say that when so often I say, actually, this liberation is not about life becoming any different to what it always was. It's not about you no longer being the human being. It's simply about the falling away of the belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome. It's very ordinary. You live as a human being more or less as you did before. The only difference is that the uncomfortableness has fallen away. But in order for that uncomfortableness to fall away, a lot of change happens, a lot of insight happens, a lot of seeing life differently, a lot of concepts coming in that rejig the way we relate to things that might happen, and we find ourselves processing it differently to the week before. And often that happens quite haphazardly, where we might just not have a specific teaching that we're working within, but we might, for example, hear a parable, like, for example, the Chinese farmer that was very philosophical about everything that would happen. He had a sequence of very unfortunate events, followed by the unfortunate event morphing into a very fortunate event, which then morphed into a less fortunate event. And whenever his neighbors would comment on how unfortunate he was, or how fortunate he was, he would always respond in the same way, which is, maybe. Oh, how unfortunate you are that your bullock that pulls the plow, which is what you need in order to survive because you're a farmer, has broken its leg. Oh, how unfortunate you are. Maybe. Because that then turned into a positive. And when the neighbors said, oh, how fortunate you are that this has happened, it's a great windfall. Maybe. And so that can strike us, that story can strike us. And we realize how we are so prone to interpreting life as if the circumstance is going to remain forever, and as if now that this has happened, my life is going to be terrible for the rest of my life. Because, for example, a job, you have lost your job. And we tend to have a mindset that looks at this and, because of the attachment to outcome, feel completely attacked by the fact that our job has lost, completely vulnerable, and lose perspective of anything that will come after. And our experience shows us that things are always changing, and that something unfortunate can turn into something fortunate. Our experience shows us that we might feel like life isn't worth living if there's some intense suffering, and then a month later we're over the moon that we're alive, feeling so grateful. That's what our experience shows us. However, in the moment, that experience, which we might have had many times, is lost, is forgotten, and a certain mentality kicks in. And so we might find that life delivers something like this story that hits us, and we focus on it for a whole month or 2 months, where that becomes our theme, maybe. And whenever our thinking gets too caught up in this is a terrible thing, another part of our thinking comes up and says, maybe. And so often life delivers these insights in a haphazard way, where often we're involved in life and not really looking at this this change in attitude, and then a little bit of that happens until we feel comfortable enough in life, because that thinking creates a degree of peace because it does cut off the suffering, and then we go back to our focusing on trying to get somewhere, and so we might have another 2 years where we don't have any insights or whatever, and then life delivers something else for us to think about. If we find that our destiny is such that we have these insights crammed into a small, short period of time with a lot of intensity, then the change can become more, quicker and also more integrated, meaning all these fragmented insights can come together, and we might see how they're all really bringing about a change in our suffering, a change in our psychological attitude to life. And so So I'm sure I was saying something in relation to that, but I can't remember what it was. So why would I describe life as radically different from how we know it, when on the one hand I just talk about life being the end of suffering, where it's sort of pretty much more or less the same as it was. You're a human being facing circumstances, your personality is the same, your preferences are the same, but what changes is your attitude. The reason for it being valid to describe life as radically different is because at certain phases on the journey, it's important for us to hear that life is not at all as we know it. Why? Because this psychological me that happens to arise in life so habitually, so automatically, maybe needs a radical shake-up of how we know ourselves in order for the habit to be undermined sufficiently. Undermined sufficiently such that at some point life can be redescribed as how it gets lived after certain reconditioning phases. And so this is why you can maybe listen to different teachings with an appreciation of why they're different, and see them not as being in opposition with each other, but being complementary to each other, serving the seeker in a way that they help do whatever part of the job needs to be done at that point in time. So today I will encourage you to spend time from time to time in your day, and this is only if it happens, because on the one hand I'll encourage you, which is simply new conditioning, saying this may be very appropriate for you not to label what is happening in the moment, not to think of it from the point of view of the person, from the point of view of the human being living life, but to, on occasion, to just stop and experience prior to thinking. So a dropping away of even the working mind, which is not a type of thinking that interrupts our peace of mind. However, it might be a type of thinking that interrupts our seeing life more holistically. Not ultimately. Ultimately, the working mind doesn't disrupt our peace of mind, and it doesn't disrupt our experiencing of life as a holistic whole. But at certain phases, before certain shifts and certain dynamics have been undone, it can be valuable to stop thinking altogether from time to time during the day. Now, you won't be able to, it's an unrealistic expectation to think that there will be no thinking for a whole day, for example. This isn't something that we can do. This isn't a prescription or an instruction to the individual to stop thinking, as if you're holding your breath. Because if we're trying to stop thinking in the same way as we're holding our breath, what happens is the pressure builds up, and there's actually a thought trying to stop thinking. Because the one trying to stop the thinking will be a thought, oh, I need to stop thinking. And then that will be, oh, look, there I go again, stop it. And that is more thinking, trying to stop thinking. And even if you're literally holding your breath to stop thinking, it's not the natural stopping that I'm talking about that may just happen. It may happen when we look at life without assuming the separation that language implies. So because we have a name for everything, a chair and a table, a tree, a light, a person, a hand, the wall, the sky, it seems like many objects. The words have turned them into many objects. The words are descriptions or conceptual distinctions. What if they are a whole lot of labels being placed on a singularity? So a bit like a painting in a museum, a big painting that fills up most of the wall. And it's a painting of a forest with animals and some people in the forest. And you could go around with labels and put a label on a tree, and a label on a person, and a label on the rabbit, a label on the flower, and a label on the sky. Or you can look at it as a picture, a singular picture, where there aren't really separate trees and people and rabbits. There's just the whole picture. Now, it isn't wrong to see the detail in the picture, because the detail exists. The point is that sometimes the detail has prevented us from seeing the whole. And so it's worthwhile to realize, sometimes starting off with a pointer that says life is a singular experience, not known by a separate subject person. The body is an object along with the chair and the light and the other people that are actually not separate objects, but all part of the one experience. All part of the one experience arising in awareness. And it can be useful to have the pointer that says, what is aware of the experience is not the body. We're so used to knowing life from the perspective of the body that we assume that the subject is the body, whereas the body is just an object in the experience. The subject is prior to all of the objects. The subject is that in which all of the objects arise. And what you are is that formless awareness, aware of the present moment exactly as it's arising. What you are is that which is aware of the body that we assumed, that the thinking assumed was the subject. Any sounds are not coming from outside of you. If we remain heavily identified with the physical body, then any sounds are assumed to be heard by the ear, and therefore the sound is outside of the body. But what is hearing the sound is not the ear. That is a concept, a belief that has been put in place as part of our assumption of what life is. An assumption that keeps life known only from one perspective. The seeing isn't done by the eyes. The smelling isn't done by the nose. All of these functions, faculties, are being registered by the formless awareness. And the formless awareness doesn't need to think in order to be aware. So from time to time you might like to find a movement happening. It's not really you might like to, but you might find a movement happening where there's a stopping. And awareness is aware of the whole, knowing that all of the seemingly separate objects have no boundary between them. It seems like, from a visual perspective, that there's a boundary. If we can transcend that and see it's all like a photograph or a vista, and that the space is not separate from the object. And then we might become aware of the awareness that even transcends space. And the awareness is the container in which the whole experience arises. So this is where it's very valid for a teaching, for the spiritual pointers to say you are not the body. You are not the human being. You are not the person. So if thinking arises that says, I am a person, and we know it's saying that because of the narrative that says, that person shouldn't have done that to me. So in that narrative, there is a referencing in the thinking of the identity being the person. And so for a while, or interspersed from time to time, stop and be the awareness. And maybe be aware of any story about the person. And realize that it's not a story about the person I usually describe, but a story about the psychological person, the person that thinks they are the doer, the other is the doer, and that their happiness is to be found in outcomes. And even that thinking can be witnessed as objects arising in the present moment experience, not separate from the imagery and the sounds and the smells. This is a resting in the dimension of life that is outside of the flow of life. This is the dimension of life, and for that matter, the dimension of the human, where stillness and silence can prevail. This is the dimension of life where meditation happens. Meditation is really the witnessing of life as a happening. Allowing everything to be as it is, including the functioning of the body, the functioning of thoughts, emotions, the way the other is. And you can see that as life unfolding as life form based on causality, or you can witness it as all appearance in awareness. Both are going to be seen as appearances in awareness. And from one perspective, it's much more about form. And from the other perspective, the form is known to actually only be experience in awareness. Both views allow for a silence to be there. What I'm describing is life known not from the head, but from a place that is much more at first body-centric, and from having dropped into the body, we might even get a sense that it is non-localized awareness. It's a strengthening of that muscle, that a strengthening of resting in that dimension of the human being that eventually turns into our capacity to allow so many of the faculties of the body to function freely and find that it doesn't disturb our connection. So thinking, for example, functional thinking can arise, speaking to the other can happen without us getting drawn out of this place within us that isn't attached to outcomes. But for a while, it may need to be strengthened when certain faculties of thought and human interaction are minimized. And this is something that you can play around with, or rather something that can just happen any time during the day. While you're working, while you're driving, while you're on the train, while you're in the garden, while you're washing the dishes, while you're chopping the vegetables. And it doesn't matter if it happens for 10 seconds or 3 minutes or 5 minutes, which means it's not a spiritual practice. It's just a stopping of knowing yourself as the body and seeing all of the objects that our mind labels as separate objects as all part of the whole experience in the present moment. And realize that each moment is exactly that, an experience that is completely different from any other experience that has arisen and is always morphing into a new experience. Sometimes the completely different is hard to see because not many of the objects change position on the surface level. On a micro level, the change is always happening, and so nothing is ever the same. So this is what Heraclitus meant when he says you can't step into the same river twice. The river is moving, is flowing, so it's never the same river for more than an instant. And life is like a river flowing, never the same life, never the same moment. And yet all of life only ever appears in this present window, the present moment, the window of now. We can call it the window of what is. And what is the only truth. Not what should be, or what could be, or what was, or what will be, but what is, and what is without reducing it down to what I think it is. So what is being suggested here is to allow what is to be without labeling it, just know it. Know it directly from this perspective of witnessing consciousness, knowing that the experience is not outside of the consciousness that is aware of it. This is the realization of non-dualities, to realize that the objects are not separate from the subject awareing the object. So that's where what previously we thought was the subject-object relationship, because it was one object believing itself to be the subject, aware of other objects outside of itself. So when we're perceiving life from the point of view of the object, body object, then everything seems outside of it, because we assume it is the body that is aware. As soon as the body is known, at first intellectually is considered, oh, the body is an object, just like the book and the table and the chair and the other person. The body is an object. What is aware of the object is not the object, but the awareness that is aware of all objects. And if we can register that any object that is outside of the field of awareness is not part of the experience. So even what we might imagine as a distant bark is arising within the field of awareness. So it exists inside, not outside of us. If the bark was outside of awareness, it wouldn't exist in the experience. And what we are is the formless awareness in which everything arises. So if closing eyes happen, a lot of the objects fall away. The field of awareness remains. The present experience remains. It's very different to what it was. And often there is what we can call a residual self-image that comes into the present moment when eyes are closed, saying, oh, I am a body sitting in a room with my eyes closed. And so that essentially, that thought has an immense power of reducing the experience down to what the thought is saying the experience is. So if closing eyes happen, and there is an allowing of everything to be as it is, and any thoughts that label the experience can be seen as thoughts and dropped in a way, because we say, oh, that's a thought condensing what is down to something that the thought says it is. So then playing around with the sound objects is particularly interesting. Drop the idea that there is a body registering the sounds. Be open to the notion that all sound, if it's known, is arising inside the field of awareness. And it is the field of awareness that knows the sound, not at a distance from it. That the sound and the awareness are not subject and object, but just sound happening. There isn't speaker and listener. There is just speaking, just listening. There isn't dance and dancer. There is just dancing. And when opening of eyes happens, the same field of awareness is there, and everything is arising within that field of awareness. From this perspective, life can be known in silence. And that really means the silence of thinking, where it doesn't require any thinking in order for sound to be registered, in order for visuals to be registered. That is happening because of the faculty of awareness. The thinking about what is in awareness is another movement. So the more familiar we become with the experience prior to thinking, the more familiar we are with what is. So let's address some questions. Go ahead. We don't know your name. You're called No Name.
It's Loopy.
Oh, hi, Loopy. Hi, how are you, Loopy?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm on my iPhone. I don't know why it says speak to you in Spanish.
Aha,
um,
okay.
I don't, I don't have a question, but I am in total gratitude because I've been listening to 3 years, and when we got into the lockdown, I was forced to slow down and not go to any groups.
Uh-huh.
I've been going to groups forever, and I realized that my search for healing was because I wanted to heal my mother. Remember, I'm the one that thought enlightenment would help me to heal people. But
Uh-huh.
in the lockdown and listening to you, I realized that the uncomfortableness with myself was really at the core of why I wanted to heal. And it was me. I was uncomfortable with myself.
Mm-hmm.
And in that silence, once in that slow down period, I was able to access the fact that once I realized I am whole and complete, because I've been hearing that since forever. But the block was I was not comfortable with loopy. I still kept thinking, I got to go to this group and read this book so that I can, finally understand why, whatever, but it was just that uncomfortableness with myself.
Mm.
And once it was gone, I actually fell into that silence. I've been doing silence forever too, but it was a deeper silence, and it was like I didn't do anything. It was just there. It was just the perfect peace and quiet. And then in my experience, I did feel the singularity, and then every second objects would be coming up, but they weren't separate. So all of that kind of like fell into like this, I can't explain it, but it was like a release, like, oh, this is where I've been going toward, and now it's here. And so I'm so grateful. So, because you have saved me tons of time and everything to be able to be in this peace that you were just talking about, in that silence where there is no person. It is just silence being silence, not objects. So I'm so grateful. Thank you so much, Roger.
Oh, well, you're very welcome. That's
Yes,
very nice to
you.
hear. I'm glad that some good things are coming out of the unfortunate circumstance.
Yes, me too. Thank you. Bless you.
Yeah, thanks for dropping in, Loopy.
Uh-huh.
Okay, bye-bye. Hello, Holger.
I just raised my hand because there was nobody else here. And I really have absolutely nothing on my mind. I just wanted to say thank you.
You're welcome.
And it's just beautiful and wonderful. And on one level, I have nothing to hold on to. I mean, I cannot, there's no security in my life, or I don't even have a life. But each moment by itself is totally solid and comfortable. I mean, this is, but as soon as I started to thinking, it's just, but I don't even go there. I don't have to go there. And this is so beautiful.
Uh-huh. When you say you have no security in your life, you're talking about the general fundamental uncertainty of life as it unfolds, or your specific circumstance is insecure?
I just, it's just the old patterns of thinking that I am the doer who has to have certain, who needs to participate in life and needs to move things forward. And I just don't have any of this right now. I mean, I'm just here today, and I'm following my impulses, and I'm just myself, and I couldn't explain to you life. For some reason, I don't know where this comes from, but there was always this urge inside. I would need to explain to someone how life works. This was kind of weird. But anyway.
You have that urge, or you don't have that urge, you said?
No, I had this urge for a long time. Like I would need to explain to myself how life works. I mean, this just enforcing the separate self in a way. One thing that just into my mind, that non-duality, like you said, it's not about the falling away of the subject and the object. It's just realizing that there is only one self.
Yes, and in very practical terms, it's exactly what you've just been saying. It's the end of this psychological me component. So it's really the falling away of that, and when that falls away, we just find that there is life unabated. Life happening. So I think it's great to hear when you said, at the moment, it's just, if the thinking mind pops up, then there's problems. But as soon as it just falls away, and it's a great gift. I don't know if it's just not arising, or if it arises and you find that a thought says, "Oh no, don't go there," and it just falls away. But either way, I think it starts off usually with us realizing, there's that thinking again. So, and we find there's somewhere else to rest. I think that's a great gift if that's happening. And to the extent that the thinking mind doesn't arise, and you just find, it doesn't even need to get cut off because it doesn't arise. That's an even bigger gift.
Reminds some days ago, I came again. There is this thing in the Bible. It says fear of the Lord, and I always struggled with this, because how can there be, if God is love, how can there be a fear of the Lord? And to me, Lord just becomes. But now I understand what it is, because there is a part hard to explain, but. I don't even want to explain it. Sorry. It doesn't work right now. I cannot think about it. And everything is fine. And thank you so much for your presence. And I look forward to seeing you another time.
Thank you, Holger.
And one question I have. Is it a conscious decision that you turned off the chat in Zoom?
I'm not sure. Not by me. I'm not the moderator. I leave it up to Daniela to look after. I'll ask her.
Okay, good. Because it's turned off since several weeks, and I just wanted to know if this was a decision of yours or something. Okay, good.
Right. Okay. I know that at the very beginning of the live broadcast, there were a couple of people saying that the chats were distracting them. And then when it got turned off to try it without the chat, then people couldn't talk to Daniela. So I'll find out where we stand.
Where only people can privately chat with each other. I think this would be nice, because you hear someone sharing something, and then there is no way to connect to this person. I mean, this maybe would be a nice way to... Anyway, thank you so much, Roger.
Thank you, Holger.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Goodbye. Hello, Frank.
Hi, Roger. Can you hear me?
Yeah, coming through loud and clear.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Roger. Yeah, I also put up my hand because there's not a lot of people asking questions, so I thought I'd put in a quick one.
Okay.
So I deal with a lot of what they call PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, and I wake up in the morning with a lot of physical pain, a lot of feelings of shame. I call it shame. I don't really know if it's shame, but it seems like it is. I had some things happen to me when I was a child that, without going into details, where I had somebody put a lot of shame on me. My dad, he put a lot of shame on me for different things. And so I wake up with this feeling of shame all the time. It's so painful. It's one of the most painful things I can experience, but it also turns into physical pain. So I was hoping that, and I know that anything you say is not a prescription, but a description. So I'm okay with that. But I still want to just put this out there that I would love to have this happen in my life where I just, walk around without this feeling of shame and feeling like, like I'm not good enough, or I don't even know what it is, to be honest. I don't even want to put words to it, like you were saying today. I don't want to describe it, but it feels very, very painful. And I was hoping that the non-doership idea would sink in and, and land on me, as you say, and just do away with this feeling of shame. So just wanted to say that, put it out there for whatever it's worth. And thanks for any response that you give me.
Right. Okay. Well, shame is definitely linked to doership because it's essentially going, I wasn't an adequate son. That's what the father was saying. And then we believed it. Oh, yeah, I'm not adequate and I'm the doer. I should have been adequate. I failed at being adequate. And so if the doership falls away, it's like there never was a doer. There isn't anyone who failed to be an adequate son. There was just a happening in life. And the father saying that that was also a happening, so there's no one to blame either. Now, so that will dissolve the shame. The thing is that we can't go in and say, oh, if that's going to dissolve the shame, I have to realize I'm not the doer, because that's the doer coming back in again, saying, oh, I, the doer, must realize that there is no doer. So what I've just said is a description that if the doership belief does fall away, then the shame will fall away. But that's, destiny. That's up to life. So my suggestion is probably what you're doing, because when we speak, I get a sense that the understanding is percolating in. So you can relax because life's doing its job. So I suspect that there isn't a doer trying to do it, which is great. Just let it be. Another thing I would say in relation to shame, which is maybe some information that will bring about a certain relationship to the shame, is that we need to understand, at least intellectually, that all forms of suffering are based on a misunderstanding of who we are. Essentially, that suffering is an error coming from a deeper error. If it gets locked in, that the uncomfortableness, the shame, the blame, the pride, the worry and anxiety, the expectation, all of that is suffering. It's all uncomfortable. Our true nature is not to feel uncomfortable. So the uncomfortableness has to be coming from the false sense of self. The false sense of self means not who I really am. So we can then know, oh, these feelings are not true. They are there, right? So I'm not saying that they're not there. I'm not saying we should deny them. We can feel them. But if a part of us understands they're there, but they are not based in truth, they are not telling me the truth, they're essentially a lie, they're a misunderstanding. And that can, without us knowing why, can create a weakening of the involvement in the shame. I prefer to use the example, and in principle it's the same, of anxiety and worry. If someone experiences anxiety and worry, it comes in like a cloud, as if someone has injected the body with a serum, and within seconds the serum goes through the body, and suddenly there's this anxiety, this sense that things are going to go wrong, and an uncomfortableness with just being here because it feels so threatening, so unstable. And one thing we need to another thing we need to register about shame and anxiety, about all of the forms of suffering, is they're extremely convincing. So the feeling tells us it's true. That's the danger, because when we believe it's true and that's how it feels like this is not a lie, this is the truth. That's what it feels like. And so if there's nothing in the system tempering the fact that it feels true, then that means we're completely sucked into it, and we think we are it because it feels like the truth, and so therefore it is who we are. Now with anxiety, what most people have realized is that the anxiety tells us things are going to go wrong, and in practice what we're afraid of doesn't tend to happen. You might be convinced that you've failed your exam and then you actually get your exam and you've got a very good mark. You might be convinced that you've got a deadly illness. You go to the doctor, get the test, and you find out that there's nothing to worry about. So our experience has shown us that anxiety presents itself as if it's the truth, as if something terrible has happened. It's like there's no question, this is what the outcome is going to be. And lo and behold, it doesn't turn out that way. So if we start registering, this feeling feels very true, but it's lying to me. And even if the outcome was in line with what we were anxious about, that's just a coincidence. It's not because the anxiety was telling me the truth. So as a blanket rule, these feelings are lying to us. But they feel so convincing. So the explanation I've given, which might create an image that can help maybe, is it's like a salesman that comes up and he's so convincing. And this salesman wears a red jacket. And whenever the salesman comes up, he sells you this product because he's so convincing. After 10 minutes, you're sure you need this product. And then you get home and each time the product is a waste of money. And one day you register, you say, whenever this salesman comes up to me, he's completely convincing, but let me remember that he's always lying to me. He's got the red jacket on. The man with the red jacket, I'm always going to get enamored by him. But if he has a red jacket, I have to remember he's the con artist. And so your shame, the anxiety is like that salesman, very convincing. A part of us needs to go, oh, there's the salesman with the red jacket on. And you can't get rid of the salesman with the red jacket on. He's gonna, if he's there, he's there. But you can keep remembering he's telling you a lie. So see if that new conditioning, and this isn't something for you to do, Frank, right? Don't say, okay, tomorrow I'm going to get rid of my shame because I know I'm going to remind myself and be very vigilant at saying that this shame is not telling me the truth. I wouldn't suggest to go about it like that. Just see if when it comes up, something is there in your system that goes, this is destiny. It's destiny for this uncomfortable feeling to be here, but this is not who I am. What I am is that which is prior to that, right? Prior to that feeling. And it's about a non-involvement, essentially, not trying to push the feeling away, but just knowing it's not, what it's telling me is not true.
I was trying to.
Say that again, Frank. You're just breaking up.
That helps a lot. Yeah. Appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Oh, good.
Can you hear me, Roger?
The internet broke up.
Okay,
Frank.
yes, sir. No, I was just saying thank you so much. That does help me a lot, and that's all I can say. Just thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Frank.
Thank you for your response. That'll help me.
Good one. Let me know how it goes.
Get alive going forward.
Hi, Mark.
Hi.
Hello.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hi there.
Go for it.
Sorry. I might just be trying to figure things out here, or however it appears. But you spent some time when you first met Ramesh. Due to the being reined in, I don't know, I got the impression, a couple months kept you in one place. And during that time, essentially your seeking came to an end. Years of seeking fell away as a result of what happened in that period of time. And I've always wanted to ask you a couple things about it, but in particular, how much of that result, that happening, would you attribute to the teaching per se, and how much of that might you attribute to being eye to eye with Ramesh?
I think it was a lot about being there. But let me just, I guess I don't often have an inclination to talk about the sequence of things. I'll try and do it very briefly because I guess there was about 4 years where before meeting Ramesh, where the teachings started to come in a way that I didn't know they existed. I didn't know that there were these books on spirituality. And so essentially I found myself immersed in non-duality from the beginning. And there was about 4 years of top-down non-dual teachings, primarily A Course in Miracles, Ramana Maharshi's teaching, Nisargadatta's teaching, some Buddhism, some Jesus teachings, and Lao Tzu, and what's his name? Wei Wu Wei. So more or less a group of 5 or 6 top-down teachings for about 4 years, and that was my source of information. That each time I'd read a chapter, I would find myself out walking, looking at the life experience and trying to see it from the perspective that it was described as in the non-dual top-down teachings. So primarily it was talking about, what you are is awareness, you are not the body, life is an illusion, life is a dream, everything is arising in consciousness. So very much top-down teachings, focusing on the ending of certain thinking that kept a dualistic relationship to life in place. And I felt like that process was extremely fluid, and I felt like I was being taken on a magic carpet ride where there was lots of sort of synchronistic unfoldings and lots of contemplating, lots of insight. One thing turned into another. The model of life kept changing, and my experience of myself and the experience of life included many radical shifts to the point where I really felt like the person, the doer, or knowing myself as the body, identification with the body had fallen away. And that's when I found myself, I guess, going to see Ramesh, which was in 2005, as a more or less a paying homage to Nisargadatta. That was one of the major teachings that I was involved in that phase. So when I went to see Ramesh, I sort of felt like the process had largely happened, because I thought the process was about knowing myself as not the human being, not the body, seeing life as a happening, as a predetermined story, as a dream, as an arising in consciousness. And so that was well and truly my experience, thanks to the teachings that were talking about life that way. And when I went to Ramesh, I was very surprised to find that he wasn't talking about life being experienced from the point of awareness, but very much reinforcing the presence and the existence of a human being. So at first I thought, I've come to sort of kindergarten, and it was surprising that the translator of Nisargadatta, one of the translators of Nisargadatta, was now talking about what seemed to me to be a very preliminary type of spiritual teaching and spiritual seeking. I was only there in the first visit, supposedly for 1.5 days, just one satsang, and it turned out to be about 10 days, about 9 or 10 satsangs. And by that time, the airport had opened up again, and I left, only to return within 3 months for my second visit. Now, on the first visit, something very significant happened in terms of a collapsing of a set of beliefs that were in place that I didn't realize were still in place. And those beliefs were, what I am is consciousness, I am invulnerable, I am untouched by the flow of life. Everything is happening exactly as it's destined to happen. Those were the ways I was seeing life and I was experiencing life, and yet I didn't realize that those concepts, which had had such an effect on the way I knew myself and the way life, I didn't realize that they had been turned into beliefs. And because of a couple of interactions with Ramesh, where he sort of picked up on the fact that these concepts were being held on to a little bit too strongly, which wasn't my experience, because my experience was that there was largely peace of mind. And it was only in hindsight that I saw that I was holding on to them, unbeknownst to me, as beliefs, and they were creating some remaining suffering. So in those first few days, we had some direct talks, and it wasn't, I don't think it was so much about being there eye to eye in terms of some energetic thing, although I won't say it wasn't, because I really do think that the belief systems in the body have a resonance, have a density, have an energetic frequency to them. And when someone doesn't have those beliefs, essentially their body is energetic, but without that frequency. And I think there's a sort of tuning fork type resonance that happens, and the frequency without the doership can have an effect on dislodging the frequency of doership in someone else's system. So I'm not discounting that, but where I would say it was particularly useful is that he was able to see specifically what the sticking point was in me, just because of the discussions that we were having. And so if I was reading a book, there's the general information in there, but I don't have him in front of me seeing from his perspective and going, that's doership over there, that's attachment to outcome there, in a very specific form, so he can see it in how it's presenting in Roger. And so then his comments to me were very specific, and I remember the comments, there were one or two comments that he made that just stuck, and they kept going round and round and round until they penetrated into what they were aimed at. And it was very mystical in a sense. When they penetrated, it was really like an arrow. And when they kept going round and round, it felt like an arrow circling me until it stopped just as I clicked what it meant, what he was pointing at. It's like the arrow stopped and hovered. And at the point when my thinking clicked and got it and saw that these beliefs were still there, this identity as being, I am consciousness, I am invulnerable, I'm untouched by the flow of life, and everything is happening exactly as it's destined to happen. Once it clicked, the words he said sort of just penetrated into my being, or into my, well, not my being, but into the belief system, I think. And the seeing of that by myself, inspired by the words that he put forward, that obviously were put forward because he could see that dynamic in me, just shook everything up. And that belief collapsed. My experience is that there's so many of those layers of belief that collapse. And so this was very significant. It was it was a collapsing of belief that happened in quite a dramatic way when I touched his feet one time, which the first day I swore, I said, well, I saw everyone lining up to bow down and touch his feet, and I said, well, this is really weird. You wouldn't catch me doing that. These people seem to have confused this, sweet old man as something to worship. And I remember this thought, you wouldn't catch me doing that. And there I was 2 days later, seeing the body stand up, join the line, and prostrate at his feet. Simply because what he had said had such an impact on me and had changed something so necessary, that this gratitude and this was a sign of respect. It wasn't a sign of worship. So when that happened, there was a very profound breaking of the structure that had been severely weakened in the previous 2 days. Now, that wasn't the end of the seeking. It was the beginning of the integration of the understanding that what I am is formless awareness, and integrating that into a more complete understanding of what I really am, which is a human being that includes the awareness aspect to it. So then, over the next 4 years, I visited Ramesh more or less 16 times. It worked out to be every 2 or 3 months over 4 years. And I feel like after the first year, the majority of the seeking had come to an end. I guess it really, the end of suffering in my experience came to an end in, I guess, 2007, which was 2 years after I had met him. And then I just kept going back for the sake of being with someone who I loved.
That helps a lot, particularly, I guess, because for some reason I had this thought that you benefited in the first 10 days and I've comparative, huh? Been at it for over 40 years, and I'm getting good at catching thoughts that maybe I could just laugh at and let them go. I can listen to your presentation today and get carried away from that which enjoys the naming, appreciate the naming and appreciate the painting.
Mm-hmm.
And there is this persistent nudge that kind of says, what if it's not your destiny to ever get anything further than you've got it already, so to speak? And I realize the paradox of even those sentences, you've got it, etc. But, there they are, they're said. And guess what? I'm mostly not comfortable with that notion that this is it, what you've got. This is it. And I realize the silliness also of those sentences, because probably one of the most beneficial, I think, pointers over the years I've been at it was a recognition that when I think I'm going through something that I've gone through 1,000 times already and I'm about to do the same thing over and over and over and over, I grab this pointer that says it's instantaneous. There is no repetition. Mm-hmm. Repetition's all in the mind. That's something else that's making this repetitive. And that almost, so to speak, instantly keeps me from that craziness. At any rate, I don't know. I don't think there was a question there anywhere. I think you gave me what the point of my putting my hand up was. And also, I'm nearly at your feet because in all of the same studies, maybe not as intensely as you may have studied, to include way. Oh man, that slipped by, the finishing of that sentence. I've appreciated top-down teaching, bottom-up teaching. I've appreciated it. And I've read Ramesh, and yet I never quite appreciated getting a good feel for the aspect of doership. And oh wait, yeah, maybe this was part of a question. And I think what I've tried to do, as much as is doable, is instead of countering adverse thoughts with a pointer, is to just appreciate the space of silence. Mm-hmm. I think this has been more what's been happening currently. And it's comfortable, and I think maybe even though patience implies time, I can appreciate the relativity of that. I guess there wasn't a question there after all. Sorry.
No, that's very fine. What your initial question? I don't often promote stuff, but because your question was very pertinent to this, is that for a long time I haven't agreed to one-on-one sessions because I figured, well, the information is there and there's some retreats. But of late I've been doing some one-on-one sessions and been surprised actually at how they seem to be beneficial because of the fact that we can go in, I can feel the other person, feel where they are, and tend to be able to see the specific, I guess, the specific dynamics of their thinking that are very clearly where the doership and attachment are from my point of view. However, I know that when there's not much distance, it can be much harder to see where the dynamics in us are. That it's easy to see the dynamics that we see. It's the ones that we don't see that tend to remain hidden. So, unfortunately, there is a cost associated with the one-on-ones, because I've had to stop answering messages because I just don't have enough time, and so the cost generally means people can assess whether it's important enough to ask a specific question or have an answer to a certain question. But that's very much available, and so I'm not suggesting that anyone should do it, but if it feels like, that's something I'd like to explore, then I've specifically added it into the teaching so that there can be this this one-on-one investigation, essentially, that that is what I described happened when I was sitting with Ramesh.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you, Mark. Drop in some other time.
All the time. Thank you.
Okay. So, on that note, we'll draw it to a close for today. Thank you for joining, and I wish you all peace.